You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Sean McFate on the show with me today. He has an amazing new book, which I'm holding in front of me right now. It's called High Treason, and this is the third book in a series, and we're going to talk all about how this series got started, and Tom Locke, and all the great characters that we meet in it. Welcome to the show, Sean.
Thank you, Hank. It's great to be here.
I'm excited to have you, Sean. I love this book so much. As a fan of Tom Clancy, since the late '80s or so, this book it hit all the buttons for me. I'll just tell you that right now. But we begin each show with the same question, and we've got to get that out of the way before we get started. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, my first memory was probably in sixth grade or fifth grade. I had done like this weekend camping trip with other people, and it was in the winter, and it was horrible. And I made a little story. I called it Frostbite, and that's when I first kind of felt like, I could do this.
That's amazing. Did I hear that you studied violin, and that was one of your aspirations when you were a youngster?
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of career ADD. I began the world as a violinist. Starting at age 3, at age 9, I went to a musical boarding school in Manhattan, in New York. That was a feeder school for Juilliard and Eastman and Curtis, these musical conservatories. And my goal was to play Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto at Carnegie Hall at age 17. And at age 13, I had my first midlife crisis when I realized I was good, but not that good. So I quit, like in a very teenage moment, just like quit everything. But I've always retained this passion for classical music. And I have this great party trick that if you play some classical music on the radio, or I can tell you what it is. And it kind of makes its way into my novels, too.
Wow. So what did your parents think of you just deciding at 13 to have a midlife crisis and change the direction of everything?
Well, it was kind of weird because neither of them were musical. Most musical prodigies come from musical families. My family was not. I just, at age 2 or 3, just said I really love Beethoven, and I go to tag sales and buy sets of Beethoven symphonies for 10 cents. And my mother was disappointed. My father was less so. But then I kind of transitioned. I took all that passion and I went, in school, but later on in the Army, I ended up becoming a paratrooper for many years. And sometimes people ask me, like, well, Sean, how did you go from like violin to being a paratrooper? And actually, it's very similar because the discipline it takes to master an instrument like that at a young age is kind of the same discipline you need to become an elite soldier.
So how did you make that jump? It looks completely sane in your mind, and you can draw, clear designated lines from violin to paratrooper. What were some of the decision points for you?
Well, it's a great question. That was not my life goal. As it's been said before, life is what happens when you're making other plans. I went to Brown University, which is a very liberal college. I loved it. My goal was to be a professor of philosophy. I wanted to be in a small liberal arts college in New England with elbow patches and a pipe, talking about Heidegger and Hegel. But I kind of felt that would have been. I didn't respect that, going from university into the ivory tower with no life experience. And so that's part of it. Another reason is that my grandfather was a vet of World War II and a vet of the Battle of the Bulge. and was shot and left for dead by both the Americans and the Germans, fished off the battlefield by nuns. And like most of people in that generation, he never spoke about the war. But he always told me as a young kid, like, Sean, no matter what you do, you will serve in the military. You will serve your country, and then you can do whatever you want. And I took that very seriously. So when I left Brown, I volunteered for the Army and for the 82nd, and I got it. And then I discovered I was really good at that, which is not what I expected, and I really enjoyed it. So I stayed for 8 years.
Wow. When you were serving, how observant were you to the things going on around you? It's easy to look back now and say, oh, I had this experience and this made its way, in some cloaked way into the book that I wrote. Were these things cognizant? Were you cognizant of the things going on around you and thinking at the time, I'm going to use this situation or something similar to it in the future? Or kind of what's your attitude when you're in the midst of these things?
Well, when I was doing these things, I've done many strange things in a weird, career arc. It was never like, I'm going to write about this someday. It was always like, when I was in the Army, I was going to I'm going to be a general or something. Like, I'm going to be a special forces guy. That's what I wanted to be. And I had good mentors. So my mentors were Stanley McChrystal, who was then a lieutenant colonel, then became 4-star general, and also David Petraeus, who was then a colonel who became 4-star general. And both these were formative years, and I learned a lot from these two men who are very different in many ways. And I remember one night we did a parachute drop in Sicily Drop Zone, which is this big drop zone in the middle of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I ran into Colonel Petraeus that night in the middle, after we had done our sort of operation. And at night, you really can't tell who's who. And we started to talk, and we're talking about like the Vietnam War. This is the early 1990s, right? Like, what happened in the Vietnam War? And I remember him telling me, Sean, you're too smart for the Army. You should get out and get a PhD. and at the time, I really thought that it was like the worst thing in the world. I wanted to become a general, and this colonel who's going to obviously become a general telling me I should leave the Army. But he was right. And Stan McChrystal wrote my recommendations for Harvard, and I got in there, and I never looked back. But it's funny because I always kind of felt that the military, the warrior's path would always be my path, but I would have a very unconventional one, and indeed I did.
You mentioned earlier that you went to Brown, then wound up in the 82nd Airborne. You have this path that seems to take you to extremes, from the left to the right, to the left to the right. How does those experiences, how does that form, you as a person and your ideas of the world around you?
It's a great question. So I always, as an adult, never was for a conventional path. I mean, there's obvious paths in the world to become a general, or if you want to become a partner at a law firm or a CEO, there are paths you take. And I've always eschewed those paths because I was curious. I was curious about the world. I was more curious than I was ambitious in terms of, conventional success. And so, I went from Brown to the 82nd. And then the 82nd was interesting, but I went from the 82nd to Amnesty International to learn about international security from a completely different way. And then I went from there to something called DynCorp International, and I became a paramilitary, some would say a mercenary in Africa. And, there's this, when I was a kid, I was very much influenced by this book called The Once and Future King by White. And it's sort of like it's an Arthurian legend novel. And in the beginning, it has young Arthur as a child being tutored by Merlin. And Merlin tutored him through experiences. So if you want to learn about teamwork, he turned Arthur into an ant to work in an ant hive. If you want to learn about loyalty and discipline, he turned him into a wild goose that are known for being good sentries. I mean, and that's kind of what I wanted to replicate as an adult is this type of experiential learning. Mark Twain once said, never let school get in the way of a good education. And I've tried not to let that happen.
So you go from military, then you're in the a paramilitary organization. How did being in that organization change the way that you thought of how we interact with other countries in the world? Did that alter your kind of worldview now working for this company that it could possibly be called mercenaries? Did that change the way you look at the world and how we interact with it?
Oh yeah, I mean it changed everything. And then first of all, I also write serious nonfiction about war, international relations, and my most recent book is called The New Rules of War, which is being read widely in the Pentagon, the agency, other countries like London, and people. It's a very unorthodox view that people find very compelling, but it challenges sort of groupthink. And people ask me, like, how did you come up with this? I saw war in a very different way. When I fought wars in Africa and other places, they don't look like Hollywood. They don't look like Iraq and Afghanistan. But most of the wars around the world look like what I participated in. So it changed how I view power in international relations, who's fighting for what and why. We have this rise of mercenaries in the world that nobody in the U.S. is paying any attention to. And it's one of the biggest insecurity threats of the world. We have things like the Wagner Group. Russia has this mercenary company called the Wagner Group. And to tell you, like, these are not, when most Americans think of mercenaries, they think of Hollywood villains or think about idiots like Goudreau, who tried to have this Venezuela coup d'etat, was like the Bay of Piglets now, as we joke about it. There's some of that, but that's not really, the world of mercenaries is far scarier than most people know. The Wagner Group in 2018 went toe-to-toe, muzzle-to-muzzle with our best troops in eastern Syria. They went up against Delta Force and Rangers and Green Berets. And these 500 Russian mercenaries, attacked our best troops who called in our best aviation, like B-52 bombers, F-15s, AC-130 gunships, drones, you name it. And it still took our best troops and our best aviation 4 hours to beat back 500 mercenaries. 4 hours. I mean, it should have taken 5 minutes. It took 4 hours. And what will happen when, 1,000 mercenaries are up against, the Virginia National Guard? It's going to look like Mogadishu, but much, much worse. It'll be like Black Hawk Down, but much, much worse. Modern mercenaries are very, very dangerous. It's one of the things I study in my day job as a professor at Georgetown and the War College, but I use fiction to really pull back the curtain on that, because I can say things through novels that I can't do in peer-reviewed literature, right? And so High Treason, it has these elements in it. It has what would happen if Russia was using Wagner Group covertly in Washington, D.C. to do things, to shape things. And also some of the other things I've learned when I was in the field as a paramilitary / mercenary / private CIA guy. That comes out in my fiction.
So did you publish your first nonfiction book, The Modern Mercenary, first?
Yeah, so basically how this, just to sort of back up, I was doing stuff as a U.S. government contractor mostly in Africa that traditionally the CIA would have done, or Special Operations Forces, and now they routinely outsource the most risky things to certain companies and individuals. I was part of that set. And then I went freelance, but I only worked for U.S. companies, like oil companies and stuff like that. And I looked up and I was doing things like arms deals. I was riding in the Sahara. I was making small armies for U.S. interest. I was dealing with warlords, all sorts of harrowing stuff. And I looked up one day and I realized there's nobody old in my business. I mean, nobody old. And I was in my mid-30s, and I realized I have to rethink my life choices. So I got out. And I wanted to think deeply about these things, about what it means that the world is going back to like mercenaries. And I went to do a PhD, and out of that PhD came my first nonfiction book called The Modern Mercenary, which is a very readable book. But it's a deep analysis about the return of private warfare and private warriors. And then from there, I was going to write a memoir about something I had done in Africa for the U.S. government. That was really cool. We helped stop a genocide in Rwanda and Burundi in 2004. I was like, this is an amazing story. But my agent said, no, Sean, if you do that, you'll be sued to death. So, which is true. So we fictionalized it. We took that story and we made it into fiction and did some other things, and that became the first Tom Locke book, the first Tom Locke novel, and then it launched a series. It did really well.
So going from writing serious nonfiction, like your first book was, dealing with private armies and what this means for the world, did you find that it was easier to talk about these things as fiction, even though these were informed by very real circumstances and very real people? Did changing some of the names and some of the circumstances just give you a freedom to write, or what was the experience of writing this new fiction series like for you?
Well, I could say things in the fiction series I couldn't say in nonfiction. So, and the reason is that mercenaries, it's a very secretive world. It's like writing on Narcos, but more secret. And that's in fact why the U.S. government likes to use some of these guys, because when you want something absolutely done secretly, you don't go to the Pentagon, you don't go to Langley because they leak. You can go to the private sector, right? And we're not talking about any type of mercenary. We're talking about like elite types. And I could write about that and get the point across. And I find that fiction is a much better vehicle for truth telling when you're dealing with illicit phenomenon. So if you really wanted to, for example, write about drug lords in the 1980s and 90s, you could do it in fiction better than you can do it in nonfiction. And so my fiction books are actually thinly veiled reality. And they reveal a lot about what does modern war really look like. And modern war is all in the shadows. It's not going to be aircraft carriers and F-35s doing dogfights in the South China Sea. It's not going to be like the Battle of Midway with better technology. It's going on right now. We are already at war with Russia and China. We don't know it. It's all being fought in the shadows. And my novels sort of pull back the curtain on that.
World Anvil is a browser-based world-building platform designed for all world builders, writers and novelists, dungeon masters, game developers, and everyone else. World Anvil keeps your world setting safe and organized, helps you find your characters, locations, plots, timelines, and maps quickly and easily as you write. Then, if you choose, you can showcase your amazing world building to the world, beautifully and interactively, to keep your readers engaged. You can even use our professional tier to build your career selling access to behind-the-scenes content your readers will love and growing your community. Build your world setting in any genre with over 25 custom-built world-building templates, complete with prompts to inspire your creativity. Allow your readers to explore the public parts of your world in an innovative new way with interactive maps, timelines, and wiki-style articles. Give special access to co-authors, beta readers, customers, or patrons to see exclusive behind-the-scenes content. There's a free version to get started with all of the major features. Guild membership offers you a host of extra options, including comprehensive privacy settings, co-authors, presentation options, and so much more. Join our community of over 800,000 world builders, including professional authors. Take part in competitions and learn more about world building at this fantastic online community. Use the coupon code HANK to get 20% off all 6 and 12-month subscriptions. WorldAnvil.com. I'm a recent convert and I know you will be too. So, have you been involved in modern warfare and seen it change around you? Have you been in situations where you expected a certain outcome, and then when you're actually there in the midst of it, you realize that warfare has changed around you?
Yes, exactly. So that was my big comments, my education going from, the 82nd Airborne Division, the world of Fort Bragg, into wars of sub-Saharan Africa, initially sub-Saharan Africa, but elsewhere, is that the wars that I was trained to, the military doctrine, tactics, strategy that I was immersed in was completely not applicable to those conflicts. And those conflicts, more conflicts around the world looked like them than like what the U.S. tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, which didn't work. And so the U.S., I think, is kind of tactically on the ground, nobody can beat us, but strategically we're being outplayed all the time. And there's many ways to win wars, not just on battlefields. And again, I talk about that in both my nonfiction and my fiction. They're two sides of the same coin, but the fiction can really get to the gritty details of it, which is what I like. And that comes from what I saw when I was working in that world.
Last year, the beginning of last year, you published a book called The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder. And I picked this book up because I wanted to get a good kind of overview of the kinds of things that you wrote. This book is amazing. When writing this book alongside the fiction that you're writing, how do people accept one or the other? Do you ever get people that are fans of your fiction writing, and then when you publish your nonfiction, it kind of leaves them scratching their head? How are you accepted as someone who does both so very well?
Well, first of all, accepted very well. I mean, so these both books, for example, the New Rules of War, first of all, has turned a lot of heads inside the Pentagon, CIA, MI6, Ministry of Defenses. I've been flown all over the world to talk to different defense institutions from different countries, like in Western Europe, to the Pacific Rim, to Canada, to our north, and all across our country, because the New Rules of War, basically what it says is that America, the West, it asks the question this is the question it asks. If, the last time the West decisively won a war was in 1945, right? World War II, if we're honest with ourselves. So it asks the question, if the West has the best militaries in the world, then why is the last time we really won a war World War II? That's 70 years ago. So what's the problem? And it answers with the warfare has changed. It's moved on. Our enemies grasp this, but we do not. We're fighting the last war. But modern wars are different, and it gives 10 new rules about how to fight and win in modern wars that do not look like conventional wars at all. The conventional warrior's head will explode. Now, that book forms the universe of my fiction series, of the Tom Locke series. So Tom Locke is a modern warrior fighting in modern wars. And the same logic of the nonfiction, it's totally, the novels just sort of are, an example of it. I can play it out. And so the fiction, people who like the fiction go to the nonfiction and vice versa. They attract each other.
So about 4 years ago, you published Shadow War, the first Tom Locke novel, the book that would kick off the series. We're here today talking about book 3, which is High Treason. But about 4 years ago, you published Shadow War. How did Tom Locke come to you? And did you envision that this fiction would allow you to talk about the things that you couldn't talk about in nonfiction? And how did Tom Locke come out of that?
So Tom Locke, it originally came out because I wanted to write this memoir about stuff I had done. And I was, the editor, the agents were like, no, you shouldn't do that. That's too classified, all these different things. So we've turned it into fiction. And Tom Locke is me had I never left that world. So I left that world about just over 10 years ago, right? And Tom Locke, had I stayed in and done more things, that's me. So Tom is much more badass than me and much more soul damaged than me today. And it was a fun way for me to think about what would I be like had I stayed in that world, right? Sort of like the what if-isms. But it also became a great way to share with people a side of warfare that is secretive, that nobody sees by design, and to share that with the wide world. I mean, certain people inside the U.S. intelligence community know about these things, but a lot less than you think. And so Tom Locke became this vehicle to sort of express, the workings of international relations. It rarely, countries are at war all the time, but they don't actually bubble up into CNN or Fox News. That's very rare. And when they do bubble up, then it goes quickly back into the shadows. And that's what Shadow War is about. The first novel, Shadow War, is about this new type of war. And I use the example of Russia invading Ukraine as an example of that. And this was, and again, it's thinly veiled truth. So the things, the battle scenes I talk about actually happened, right? The things that actually happen, that I talk about in the novel actually happen in real life for the most part. There's some embellishes, name changes, stuff like that, right? But I use fiction to tell truth.
So, Sean, as a writer and as someone who has written important nonfiction tomes, when you approach writing fiction, what is your process like? These are based on things that you've seen or witnessed. So do you kind of have the scenario in mind, and what sort of roadmap are you using to write with?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, I'll say this, is that fiction and nonfiction are very different to write. And I underestimated that at first. I write both, right? And I remember when I finished New Rules of War, which is serious nonfiction, written like a magazine style, though, written like my novel writing skills were used to tell a story that is nonfiction. Switching from that to fiction, I thought would take a week or two. It took 3 months. It's like my brain did not function. They can't function correctly. It's hard to describe. The way I use my mind to write fiction is completely different than the way I do it with fiction, and I discovered that the hard way. So if anybody's out there wants to do both, there's a reason why not many people do both, at least well. It's hard to do. And in terms of process, I mean, I have 25 years of doing this stuff on the ground, and I came to writing very late in my life. I never took it seriously. I loved to write, but I thought, becoming a professional writer seems like a very high bar. It's like, becoming a professional anything, right? Professional rock star or whatever. I just didn't take it very seriously. So now when I think about a new novel, I think about things and events that I either was part of or know about through inside things. So I take real life things and then I build off of that. And I sort of build like a 4-page outline of where I want to go. And then I start to write, but I deviate from that plan, right? There's a saying in the military that, a plan is, never survives first contact, right? And that's kind of what the fiction, right, is about as well. I mean, my initial chart for High Treason looks very different than what High Treason ended up being. Because as you know, and many other fiction writers know, to write a good piece of fiction, what you do is you come up with a scene, you come up with the characters, you then put the characters in the scene, and you watch what they do, and you write it down. That's how it happens.
So do you begin with a roadmap, a plan for how this book is going to go? Do you kind of mark out some of the big events and then write toward them and then see how the characters react and respond to these situations that you put them in?
Yeah, exactly right. So I have a blueprint, and then it evolves as I write. And then for High Treason, which is interesting, is that, well, first of all, I wrote High Treason, so you don't have to read the first 2 books. It can be a standalone novel as well. It's part of a series, but it's you know, it's not like Game of Thrones, or if you don't read the first part, you're going to be lost. It's,
Yeah.
you know, but when I finished High Treason, I sent the manuscript into my editor. He's like, love it, change the ending, right? So it's just like the very worst thing, because I'm just like, that's so small thing. That's gonna change everything, you know.
That's what I've been writing toward the whole time.
That's exactly. So, you know, and that's just what happens as writers. And, you know, he was right. I kind of, you know, when you submit it to the editor, you have to wait a couple of weeks for him to read it or her to read it, and you have a time to sort of stand back and think about it. And it's funny how sometimes when you're like a beagle following a rabbit, you know, you get really chasing a certain plot, and then you step back and you realize you're in the middle of the road and the car's going to hit you, you know. So, you know, I think to be a good writer, you have to have a good sense of humility too.
Absolutely. So we've alluded to it several times. The new book, High Treason. This book begins with the vice president's motorcade being attacked. What were you thinking about when you came up with this idea, and how did this book kind of hatch in your mind?
Well, it's a good question. So the first two books took place overseas in actual war zones. The first book, Shadow War, was in the Battle of Ukraine, when Russia took the Crimea and Ukraine in sort of shadow warfare-like way. The second book was Deep Black, and took place deep inside the ISIS caliphate during that whole sector. And that was based on actual reporting. I mean, like inside stuff. I wanted to bring Tom Locke back to America. He's an American. Hold a second here. I have to get that. Plumbers, this is a nightmare. I want to bring Tom Locke back to the United States of America, and I wanted to bring him back to Washington, D.C. I've been a D.C. resident for 20 years. I've always had a base in Washington, D.C. I've always had an apartment. It's always been my home base, even though I spent many years living abroad. And I wanted to write a D.C. action thriller written by a D.C. insider like myself. I mean, I've walked the halls of Congress, Pentagon, K Street, CIA, you name it, right? As well as just the regular streets. And I wanted it to be authentic and gritty in a very DC way. I wanted to reveal the soft and corrupt underbelly that is Washington, that's inside the bubble, that very few people outside the bubble really understand. I mean, I think people intuitively know it's there, but this kind of gives you some idea what it looks like. And I'm not talking about politics, Republican versus Democrat. That's its own form of corruption. I'm talking about in the foreign policy, national security realm. And so this is like a real Washington insider view of the national security circles, from the White House to the Pentagon, the CIA, to others. And the others is a big category. And so that's kind of, and it starts with the vice president motorcade going over a bridge, and it explodes, killing the vice president, killing lots of other people. People, including the interagency, immediately think this is a terrorist act. And as the book unfolds, you realize that there could be others as well who are trying to frame terrorists, which is, by the way, modern warfare. We live in a frame or be framed world out there where information manipulation might be more powerful than firepower.
Want to grow as a writer and take your writing to the next level? Give Pro Writing Aid a try. Pro Writing Aid is a grammar checker, style editor, and writing mentor in one package. Pro Writing Aid will never replace a human editor. Rather, it helps you self-edit to a deeper level so that when you send it off to an editor, they will be able to focus on the meat of your writing and not spend their time fixing basic writing issues. Pro Writing Aid is the only platform that offers world-class grammar and style checking, combined with more in-depth reports to help you strengthen your writing. Our unique combination of suggestions, articles, videos, and quizzes makes writing fun and interactive. Writing can be grammatically perfect but still feel awkward and clumsy. Pro Writing Aid searches out elements like repetitiveness, vague wording, sentence length variation, over-dependence on adverbs, passive voice, overcomplicated sentence structures, and so much more. Nothing makes a writer lose credibility faster than spelling and grammar mistakes. Submit clean, error-free writing. Go to ProWritingAid.com and use code HANK20 for 20% off of Pro Writing Aid Premium. Pro Writing Aid, check it out today. Which is insane. When you start unraveling the story, it really gets under your skin. How we take for granted the fact that we live in a world where there's so much that we just take for granted. It's when you start realizing how vulnerable we all are, it's kind of scary, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I kind of joke that, we think that we are safe because we have the best aircraft carriers in the world, the best, fighter jets in the world. But in truth, we're not, because warfare has changed. I mean, the last time there was a strategic dogfight was the Korean War. Why are we investing in more fighter jets? The ways that countries take over these days, they don't blitzkrieg from the outside in. They reach in through things like information manipulation and mercenaries and special forces who operate in secret, and they rot a country from the inside out. That's how Russia's doing it in places like Ukraine or Syria or other places like that. That's how China's doing it too. And what the book High Treason shows is how that works, right? I'm using fiction to tell a real story, but it's fun to read. It's like a great, beach read or, airplane read, that we don't fly in airplanes anymore. But, it goes down like ice cream. But there's something that's real about it too. It's sort of like Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, but for the modern era.
Right. What do you think, Sean, about the fact that we don't fight like that anymore, yet we are trying to outspend each other in kind of this big military offensive kind of way? We're still manufacturing and buying airplanes, tanks, even though we're not going to fight that way probably ever again. We're still stockpiling and building. Is that, are we waiting for the other guy to back down so that we can then back down? Or, what is the deal?
Our adversaries, our enemies are laughing at us because they're not doing this, right? I mean, our military spends more money than the next 8 biggest militaries in the world combined, right? We're buying, new aircraft carriers. We already have the best aircraft carriers in the world. We're buying 2 more, the Ford-class carriers. Each one costs $13 billion a copy before you add aircraft and sailors. And that's like half of, Brazil's defense budget. The F-35 is a fighter plane, right? The F-35 is like this new, single-seater fighter plane that it's amazing in many ways. But do you know how much it costs taxpayers? The whole program? Just take a guess. It'll make you puke.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. $1.5 trillion. Trillion.
That's
more than Russia's
billions.
GDP on an airplane that doesn't go to war. I mean, we've been at war since 9/11 constantly, and it has 0 combat missions. 0. And, I'm an old infantry guy, an old paratrooper. We'd say in the infantry, that dog don't hunt, right? Yet we're buying more of them. And meanwhile, what war really looks like, it's what Russia and China and Iran are doing. It's like the stuff in the book High Treason. It's all this beneath the threshold, as they say. It's all the stuff in the shadows that's covert. And they use, mercenaries and special forces types of guys running, like the Wagner group. Russia has the Wagner group. They make an appearance in this book running around Washington, D.C., doing some bad things. So modern war, we're spending, there's a saying that generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. That's true for our country, I think. We're fighting World War II with better technology. Our enemies have lapped us. We're like the French with the Maginot Line, thinking we're secure behind our Maginot Line, which is the F-35. Meanwhile, Germany has invented the Blitzkrieg. That's my concern. And in some ways, I feel like I'm on a mission with both my fiction and my nonfiction to sort of open people's, apertures to this new reality.
Well, that is very true, but we cannot overlook the fact that High Treason is a great great novel. I read this. I'm walking through the house with the book up, in front of my face, kind of mindlessly doing chores, because I couldn't wait to find out what happened next. This is a page turner. It's absolutely fabulous. Do you have more plans for Tom Locke after High Treason?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me also that I wanted High Treason to read fast. I mean, I wanted it to be like making you turn the page every single page. That was my mission. And so, and it's a fast-paced thriller. And I'd like to, so I'm thinking about like, where does Tom go after this? So I'm thinking about Tom Locke number 4 right now. And I think it's going to be in the United States as well. I think I like him in the U.S., and it's a great way to think about our country, too. This book, by the way, is not political. I don't take a side on Republican or Democrat or anything like that. It's really about who we are as a people and about the next war today.
Well, the new book is called High Treason. It's the third in the Tom Locke series. Like you said, you don't need to read the other two first, although that always helps to kind of color in details and little things like that. This book is absolutely fantastic. We're going to put links to it in the show notes of this episode. Sean, if people are intrigued by all that you do and want to dig into all the great work that you do, where can they find you online?
They can look me up on my website, SeanMcFate.com. You just Google my name. It goes right there. I also answer my email, like some people I know. not you, Hank. I mean, it's other people I know. No, I respond to fans, and you'll see what I'm doing with fiction and nonfiction. I'm also busy. I consult for the Pentagon, for the CIA, and also to Hollywood and the United Nations. It's interesting stuff.
Excellent. We're going to send everyone to see you, Sean, and to pick up their copy of High Treason. So much fun talking with you. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thanks, Hank. It's a pleasure.